Hi, hello. Welcome to a new webinar of the Bankinter Foundation of Innovation. Let's wait a little bit until more people that are joining right now to the Zoom link. So we can start from the beginning with most of the participants or attendees. Okay, let's give us only 2-3 more seconds. Okay, let's start. So welcome to everyone to a new online event of the Bankinter Foundation of Innovation. I'm Marce Cancho, the head of the Future Trends Forum, and we are going to talk today about quantum cryptography with Artur Ekert. This conversation is the result of our Future Trends Forum that we held last year, and we brought together more than 40 experts to talk about the silent revolution of quantum computing and advances artificial intelligence. Our purpose is to make innovation to transform society by learning from the best, building a community of innovators, spreading knowledge, anticipating trends, and sharing them with as many people as possible, which is why we are here today with Artur Ekert. So Artur is an academic life. In his academic life, he is a cryptographist, a cryptologist, and a physicist, co-inventor of quantum cryptography. His main research interest is information processing and quantum mechanical systems. So I'm gonna leave the stage to Artur to start his speech, and he will talk about between 30-40 minutes, and after that we will have 20 minutes for questions. So if you want to make any questions to Artur, you just have to write them on questions and answers. Okay, thank you all for coming to a new event of the Bankinter Foundation.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for having me. And it is a little bit of a challenge, I have to say, to give a talk to such a diverse audience, as I understand. But so my talk essentially doesn't go into technical details. And what I would like to tell you is a story, I think a fascinating story, how two different areas. One is the art of secure communication, cryptology, and the other one is curiosity-driven research to understand how nature works, how the two somehow helped each other, how created a new entity. So it's going to be a story about curiosity-driven research in physics that helped with some really important problems in the field of cryptography. So let me try to share the screen and let's see whether I hope it's visible, the screen and everything, right? So as a spoiler, perhaps, let me just give you more or less the graphic outline of this talk. So I'm going to give you two narratives, essentially. So one about, as I mentioned, about curiosity in quantum physics, curiosity where people wanted to understand whether there is really a randomness in nature, whether nature can be understood in terms of some causal structure, whether there's really inherent randomness there or not. So here we will go back to 1935, and Albert Einstein will end up with a Nobel Prize that was given to experimentalists working on those issues last year. And there's another narrative, equally fascinating, where people dreaming about a system that can protect information with perfect security. And so this is a crypto narrative. And at some point, the two narratives merge. And I find it fascinating that two pieces of pretty basic science can actually generate something that is interesting and one would say of great interest or growing interest and increasingly of some commercial value. So this is a spoiler. You know where I'm going. You know more or less what I'm going to tell you about. Now, let me just start with the first, actually the second narrative. Let me start with the security. So again, you know, one can give a long lecture about history of secure communication. So as soon as people came up with writing, people started hiding information or modifying this, that only certain people could have access to this information. And there's a wonderful history of this field, going back to ancient Greeks and at least on the European side, so about 400 BC, where they just came up with an interesting device called scytally, which was used for permutation of characters. So you had a wooden button and you would just wrap a strip of parchment around it and then write your message lengthwise. And when you just unwrap the parchment, the letters will be scrambled on the parchment, and the parchment itself is just carried to someone who is a receiver of this message, usually another military commander in ancient Sparta. And the guy would have exactly a wooden button of the same diameter, and then would wrap the parchment around that button, the message would reappear. So you know, there was sort of interesting sequence of improvements later on. I think in Europe, again, in the 15th century, that during the Renaissance period, people really thought very carefully about how to improve secret communication. And then, so there were many interesting discoveries during this period of time. People started using more sophisticated mechanical devices. And then moving forward into the 20th century, you all probably heard the stories about Enigma, that was supposed to be an unbreakable machine, but still, you know, turned out to be not as strong as people thought. It actually quite vulnerable to attacks, which were initiated by a bunch of Polish mathematicians and later sort of perfected at Bletchley by Alan Turing and some other people. And then in this sort of like historical development, if you just ask yourself the question, can you design a system that allows you for perfectly secure communication? So if there's any lesson from history, then the answer is, well, probably not, right? So because every single time we came with a good encryption system, a system where we transform messages in such a way that they look pretty well protected, sooner or later someone else came along and said, well, actually it's not as clever as you think it is. There's a way around and there's a way to break it. So this quest for a perfect cipher, we believe sort of like ended at some point with the actually affirmative answer to this question. So there is such a thing like a perfect cipher, but in order to construct it, we have to go outside the mathematical system and actually look for some help from other disciplines. In this case, quantum physics came to the rescue. But if you just, you know, go to the level of pure mathematical operations and ask yourself, so is there a good candidate for a perfect cipher? So the answer is actually yes, and it is something that is called a one-time pad. So the way it works is that you write your message. Well, first of all, let me just introduce the two typical characters in cryptography. So we have two people, Alice and Bob, that want to communicate secretly. And so Alice and Bob, we assume that they have a sequence of binary digits that is completely random and it's secret. So it's known just only to Alice and Bob. Nobody else knows about it. This sequence is known as a cryptographic key. So here on this transparency, you can see this red key is sort of written in red. So those are the binary digits called cryptographic key. As I say, truly random, and secret in a sense that only Alice and Bob know about this sequence of numbers and nobody else. So then if Alice wants to send a message to Bob, what she can do is she can write this message in binary. You can always do it using any sort of binary transcription of your alphabet, and then add message to the key. And if there's any statistical pattern in the message, which is usually what eavesdroppers or people who want to break the ciphers are looking for, if the key is truly random, then this process of bit-by-bit addition generates a completely random cryptogram. And the cryptogram doesn't have any statistical pattern then for those who want to break the system to look at. And so Alice can send this cryptogram to Bob. Now, it looks random to anyone who is eavesdropping on this, but on the Bob side, Bob has the secret key, so the Bob picks up the key and somehow subtracts this randomness and gets back the message by exactly the same operation as Alice did, namely bit-by-bit addition. So it was actually shown by Claude Shannon that this kind of system is perfectly secure as long as your key is truly random, truly secret, so it's known only to Alice and Bob, and it's never reused. So you for every new piece of information that Alice wants to send to Bob, she has to come up with a new key. Under those conditions, we have a perfect system. So, at some point you may say, okay, my talk can stop here because there is a perfect system. It was proven by Claude Shannon that nobody actually can break the system under those assumptions. But of course, then you have to look at those assumptions. And the one that is that gives the name actually to the system, the one-time part, is the fact that you can use key only once. So there's a need to generate cryptographic keys all the time. And it's not a trivial problem. The thing is, how Alice and Bob, usually in two different locations, how we can actually generate and communicate those keys to those two different locations. So we want to have a situation where we can generate a huge sequences of truly random but identical bits in two different locations in such a way that they are absolutely secret. And it's call it the holy grail of cryptography. If you can solve this problem, you generate perfectly secure system for communication. And people tried very hard. And the most probably interesting, the most beautiful, the most practical solution came from mathematicians who somehow managed to bypass the key distribution problem by designing systems which are known as public key crypto system. In those systems, there's not just like one key, but there are two keys. And probably the best way, to those of you who are not specialists, the best way to explain it is just maybe to use this simple mechanical analogy. So imagine that I have that Alice or whoever wants to receive secret messages has a safe box, or you can produce a number of those safe boxes. And the safe box, which you can see here, has two keyholes and there are two keys. So there's one key that can only lock the box, and there's another key that can unlock the box. So you see that we introduce a certain asymmetry here. We allow everyone to have a public key, which is the locking key. So I distribute all those boxes to everyone who wants to send me a secret message. And then I attach the public key. And so if you want to send me a secret message, you use this box with my locking public key. So you have the key, you write a message, you put it into the box, you lock it. Now, the thing is that once you lock it, you cannot unlock the box with the same key. You need another key, which I have, and I don't share it with anyone, to unlock the box. So the box is then sent to me, and then I use the private key, the unlocking key, to open the box and read the message. So this is really of course, in practice, what we have is the safe box represents a certain mathematical procedure, and both the public key, the locking key, and the private key, the one that unlocks the box, are sequences of numbers, and at first glance, you say, okay, well, that's beautiful, it works, and it was brilliant that people managed to come up with this kind of idea. The problem is that it's not entirely secure, in the sense that there is a way to figure out what the private unlocking key is, as long as you know the public key. So it may be extremely difficult from the computational point of view, and in fact, the system is using mathematical operations for which we do not have very efficient algorithms. Like the most popular public key crypto systems essentially is based on the difficulty of factoring. So if you can decompose numbers into prime factors in an efficient way, then those kind of systems will not be really secure. And we know that this is actually quite embarrassing for people working in this field, because we know that quantum computers we have quantum algorithms for efficient factoring. And the embarrassing thing is that we cannot prove really that this is actually a difficult problem even for classical computers. We suspect so, but on the basis that nobody actually came up with any good idea how to factor efficiently using only classical hardware. But the fact that there is a quantum computer somewhere on the horizon, and we may be able to implement those quantum algorithms soon, so that means that there is a problem with these public key crypto systems, at least most of them. And of course, there is now a real effort to look for public key crypto system that will be immune to quantum attacks, but that's another story. So you see, that was actually the one way of looking for the ultimate security, and this is actually where essentially we were before quantum entered the stage. So we have a beautiful, mathematically speaking, systems for secure communication, but we couldn't really prove that they are absolutely secure. One may argue, of course, do we really need perfect security? It's an interesting contextual question, of course, but as we are, I'm taking sort of like extreme view here and asking, well, can we just go and design a perfect system? And in this sense, public key crypto systems it's difficult to consider them absolutely secure simply because they rely on some assumptions or some statements from computational complexity, which we cannot prove, related to the difficulty of the certain mathematical problems. Okay, so I gave you sort of like one narrative about security and the big issues that the whole field of secure communication was facing in order to design perfect ciphers. So let's go now to the other narrative about curiosity-driven research. And this is mostly about interesting question, whether nature can be truly random. Can there be a truly random event in nature that just pops up without any history to it? And of course, as you suspect, quantum has a role to play in this. So let's start the second narrative, and let me just bring them together later. So when you just historically speaking, again, in Europe, everything almost, when we in Europe, we always just go to the ancient Greeks when we want to sort of give some historical perspective on anything, essentially. But even in this case, there were two different competing views on the nature of randomness. And so one was, the division was essentially, is randomness something objective that really happens in nature? Or is it subjective? You perceive something as random simply because you don't have enough information about this event. There may be a good causal explanation, but you just simply don't have enough data, and you just perceive something as random. So those two different views were clearly represented by those two ancient philosophers. So Epicurus clearly thought that atoms swerve at random along the path. So there is something like objective randomness. And on the other side, Democritus really believed that atoms follow predetermined paths, and anything random that may happen is due to our lack of knowledge. So we have here objective versus subjective view on randomness, and this kind of thing. And again, one can go on and talk about the history of this field, and it affected all kind of different areas, including theological disputes where people were trying to think about our action, right? So, for example, if that was somehow connected, doesn't have to be connected, of course, but it was connected to the notion of free will and our responsibility. So are they predetermined, or there's element of randomness there? So in both cases, we have a big theological issue, like, for example, how can you be possibly responsible for your action if it is truly predetermined? So you are born, and it's quite clear what's going to happen and what you're going to do at every single moment of your life, because it's there is no room for any unexpected or random behavior if it is all predetermined. So it's kind of said in a way that you cannot just help your destiny. You're just simply on the path, and what will happen to you, whether, like in this the way I was trying to illustrate is with a rather dramatic version using this beautiful picture by Bosch, whether you just end up in heaven or hell, you have no influence on this. So that created a big interesting thing, is because what's the point for you to do good things or bad things if it is all predetermined? And equally, if it is random, right? So one may argue that, okay, well, how can I be, if things happen, just happen. I didn't have any influence on this, so don't blame me for something. So yeah, well, it's and again, I'm just simplifying those debates, and as I say, you don't have to bring randomness in order to talk about free will, but nonetheless, people did, and that created all kind of interesting things. And yeah, so by the way, just looking at this picture, I quite often think that actually hell looks much more interesting than heaven here, but perhaps. It's just only my subjective rather than objective perception. So quantum physics actually brought additional dimension to the whole debate, because indeed, at the level of classical physics, one could just simply stick to the view that everything is prescribed, predetermined. It could be difficult, it could be we may not be able to do it for all practical purposes, but somewhere there, if you really knew at any given moment, like if you were to be given the positions and velocities of particles, then you should be able to predict. Or this, maybe you cannot know about it, but nature knows what will happen at a given time later on. And the quantum actually put this into the question, and that looked like the in quantum physics things can happen, just pop up for no obvious reason, and that worried some founding fathers of quantum theory, like Albert Einstein, who was not entirely happy, and he thought, well, it's all probably because we do not have a good theory. It's not yet complete. Doesn't describe nature as it should describe nature. So it's a provisional concept. This quantum thing is just simply something provisional. It will eventually go away, and we'll come up with a really good physical description of the world. So Einstein thought, all this randomness popping up, the fact that you cannot just make deterministic predictions is something that is truly provisional. It's just simply that we are stupid and we are not clever enough to come up with a better theory. And this randomness was really baffling. If I were to just summarize it in one picture here. So this represents, sorry for my naive drawings, but this thing here is a beam splitter, and from the left, the yellow ball is a single photon, or could be some other particle, but say it's a single photon. So that goes on a half silver mirror. So with some, you can put the two photodetectors on the transmitted beam and the reflected beam. And then if you keep on sending those individual photons, you will notice that one of the two photodetectors clicks. So it's never that two of them, so the photon doesn't split, but you have a click either in the one that is in the same line as a transmitted beam or reflected beam. And that is actually weird if you think about it, because it is the case that, and we have this classical intuition that if we prepare experiment in the same way every single time, we should get the same result, right? So if we just prepare something and then do it again and prepare exactly the same thing and run the experiment, then we should get the same result. But in this case, no matter, we can be super precise with preparing the photons and beam splitters, so it's exactly the same. We repeat the same experiment, and somehow we cannot make a prediction where this photon will go. It will just choose to be either reflected or transmitted, but we cannot a priori just say what's going to happen. We can only make a statistical prediction, saying, with probability 50%, it will just be reflected, and with the remaining 50%, it will be just transmitted. So somehow Einstein thought, well, this is not right? So there has to be a way to say, if you really know everything about nature, just, how come this photon doesn't know where to go? It should. So that was Einstein's unhappiness with quantum theory. And, for a while, it was purely philosophical speculation. Einstein, who wrote about it, didn't actually provide any way of falsifying or just any experimental test that would actually tell you whether this is a testable proposition or not. It came later, in about 1964 or so. John Bell was an Irish physicist working in Geneva who was supposed to be working on accelerators, but after hours he had interest in the foundations of quantum theory. So funny enough, he's now mostly known for his work in the foundations and not so much about his work on the accelerators. But it's perhaps a good message to all the young people who sometimes have to do something that is not entirely their passion. So John Bell managed to turn Einstein considerations into a testable proposition that we call Bell inequalities. And so you see those Bell inequalities written on the blackboard. They can be explained in a very simple way. I even have this one slide of explanations, but for the sake of time, it's maybe not so important to go through this. It's just to say that you can set up an experiment where you generate two particles that come from a source. We call them entangled particles. And then we have two experimental devices, one that is owned by Alice, the other one that is owned by Bob. They're just miles and miles away. And both Alice and Bob, for each incoming particle from the source, choose what to measure. So for example, they can choose to measure different polarizations, where I call them A1 and A2 for Alice and B1 and B2. So it doesn't really matter. It's just two different properties on each side are measured, and it is chosen randomly what they are. But those are physical properties that can be used to carry information. So for example, if there's a polarization, you can assign to two different types of polarization, two different values to each polarization. And A1 and A2 represent different types of polarization. So nonetheless, so there was then something that experimentalists can really do. In this case, they can falsify this worldview that if you assume that the nature is really deterministic, so that there is something hidden that we haven't yet quite discovered, the so-called hidden variables, that once we know them, we'll be able to make really precise predictions. So if the Bell inequalities are satisfied, then there is such an explanation. There is this underlying structure, sort of, which allows us to make a deterministic prediction, and all randomness is only perceived by us. It's not there. But if it is violated, then the opposite is true. So that this randomness is inherently there. There's no way to describe this process any better, in fact. And so, about 10 years later, John Clauser is credited as a young postdoc at the time to give it a try, to sort of like set up an experiment. And he was persuaded at the time that he will probably see he will not see the violation of Bell inequalities, that he will probably see them satisfied. Therefore, there is some kind of a good underlying explanation how nature works in a deterministic way. He was doing all this against, this was not a very popular topic at the time, and he was doing this against the advice of his supervisor, but nonetheless, he gave it a shot, and he saw the violations, which was quite surprising. But apparently his supervisor didn't like the fact that he was doing his kind of stuff, and John left physics for just focusing on his sailing hobbies or the like. So, a bit of an interesting story, again, that those real pioneers had difficult time at the very beginning to do experiments in this field. So here comes another experimentalist who saw the violation of Bell inequalities in another beautiful experiment. This was done about 10 years later, but in much more careful and much more sort of precise way. So with Clauser experiment, one can still find lots of loopholes and ask lots of questions whether it really is the case. But with Alain Aspect experiment, it was just becoming more and more clear that the Bell inequalities are really, that there are situations where they are violated. And I think at this point, at least for me, reading this work, it was like I felt persuaded that this must be the case. I mean, those experiments were very compelling in sort of telling you that, weird, but the nature contains a real randomness in it. It's not that you just perceive something as random, but it is there. It is really there. And so, now I brought you to this sort of a point where on one hand, we have, on the security side, we have people and cryptologists trying to find a perfect cipher, and they need this true randomness popping up in two different locations. And on the quantum side, we have people working on Bell inequalities and proving that there is true randomness in nature. And the Bell inequalities were based on a certain correlations that essentially allowed for this phenomenon of two random strings which are identical to pop up in two different locations, and at the same time to certify that they were not sort of like pre-programmed, pre-generated, predetermined by someone who would just play the role of the hidden variable kind of entity. So then this sort of, now I may take a credit for bringing those two fields together. I have to say though that fusion of quantum and crypto as such happened before that. So there was Gilles Brassard and Charles V. Bennett came up with ideas of using Heisenberg uncertainty for cryptographic purposes, but that didn't touch really the foundations of physics. So here we have actually a fusion of the truly foundational research and the key distribution idea. And the idea that, in fact, one can use the Bell inequality as a test for eavesdropping and generating keys. And that opened all kind of interesting questions, because now if you can do it, people working on the security side started asking questions, hey, how about this? Can you close this loophole? And the physicists who were doing the foundations were then challenged in a different way. It was not only curiosity-driven research, now it has practical applications. So there were a number of interesting, beautiful experiments, was to mention Anton Zeilinger or Nicolas Gisin or John Pan and many others, who now, knowing that if we want to have a not only curiosity answer to sort of our foundational questions, but to have those Bell inequalities playing a practical role, we have to just do a little bit more than just violate Bell inequalities. We have to just do it in such a way that all kind of possible loopholes are closed and so on and so forth. So that put a sort of a bar a bit higher and challenge experimentalists to go back and do Bell inequalities in a different way, simply because, so do experiments with the Bell inequalities again. But the game has changed at this point. It was not about showing that, yet again, that quantum physics is right. Nobody at this point had any probably issues with quantum physics. People kind of accepted that it is weird, it has this randomness. But at this point, the Bell inequalities were needed to design perfect systems by providing the safe way of distributing the keys. So as I said, so that started a very interesting progress in the whole field. Let me just keep this, but essentially, if I were just to summarize the line of thinking, so violation of Bell inequalities show that the photons do not carry any predetermined values of polarization, and somehow those values do not exist prior to measurement, and if they are not available, they are not available to anyone, including eavesdroppers. So this testing for Bell inequalities was essentially test for eavesdropper. But what was interesting was that, this shows the first experiments that we were trying to set up in this field with my colleagues at the time in what used to be called Defense Research Agency in Malvern back in 1991. Which we did, and lots of funny stories to be told about this, how difficult it was to persuade establishment to do the basic fundamental semi-philosophical stuff for practical purposes. But the most interesting thing is that somehow the scheme that is based on the Bell inequalities can be used for something that is called, which is almost like a dreamlike scenario for cryptologists, can be called like device-independent cryptography. So you can remove many assumptions from secure communication. In particular, the interesting thing, you can remove assumption that about your devices. You can essentially create a scenario where the violation of Bell inequalities gives you the test that your devices are working properly as well. So you can purchase your devices, your crypto devices from your adversary, from your enemy. And you don't have to worry that there will be some kind of Trojan horse or something that is, a backdoor system that leaks information, simply because if you run the Bell inequality test on those devices and you see the violation, so those devices have to be genuine. So in this sense, the Bell theorem, or the Bell violation of Bell inequality, is rigid. So you can do it only in one way. And just to prove the security of this device independent scenario, which is like ultimate dream for cryptologists, took a while. So, for example, we had three colleagues who did it: Rotem, Arnon Friedman, and Renato Renna and Thomas Vidic, who managed to finally just come up with interesting proof that it all really works. And the most beautiful thing is that this is all real, that can be implemented. And last year we saw a number of interesting experiments where showed that the device-independent crypto is in principle possible. So, and it coincided more or less with the three people who contributed a lot to making those experimental devices that allow us to violate the Bell inequalities. They got the Nobel Prize. So it was a beautiful kind of a finale where you have experimentalists working, curiosity-driven research, and cryptologists coming and creating something that is amazingly secure and amazingly just giving essentially ultimate security. So that's more or less, all I have to say, except, just to say that it all, this in my case, started in 1991. It took a while to see the proof of principle experiment. Probably the most impressive is the one that was performed by our Chinese colleagues in 2019, using a dedicated satellite to use those entangled photons and distribute the key over the difference of distance of over 1,000 kilometers. So I never actually expected that this would happen in my lifetime, but never underestimate experimental colleagues. It's not the end of the story, really, because there are things that one can go on and say when one has to work on this and this and this. But nonetheless, I'm going to stop here, because I think that the point that I was trying to make is that the basic research is absolutely needed, because it just brings the most fantastic surprises that you can probably have. And in this case, there's purely philosophical, blue sky research about the nature of randomness resulted in the best cryptographic system that we can possibly design these days. So thank you very much for your attention, and if there are any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them.
Thank you, Artur, for this magic and this magistral. It was like a master class. Now I have some questions for you. Can you okay, can you switch? Okay, perfect. Okay, I think I have here one question from the audience, okay? And I have some more with me as well. So could you still break the cryptography keys by brute force with a quantum computer, for instance?
The short answer is no. So quantum methods of encryption are immune to quantum attacks. So we can show that whether you have a quantum computer or not, it doesn't really matter. Even if you have one, you cannot break quantum key distribution the way we do it, simply because it's proven to be secure even against quantum attack. So yeah, the answer is no. It's secure against all kind of quantum attacks.
Thank you. In your opinion, what are the most promising applications of quantum cryptography today?
Well, yeah, no, it's a very good question. So of course, we are driven by our passion to generate systems that are perfectly secure, almost. And the question is, do we need this kind of security, and under what kind of scenarios we can what are the use cases, right, for quantum crypto? And And we know that quantum cryptography at the moment seems to be very good at the point-to-point communication. So it's good for example, you can imagine that it may be good if you have two database centers in two different locations and you would like to synchronize those data in a very secure way. So that would be perhaps the area where quantum cryptography can help. Then, of course, cryptography today has many other we use it in other scenarios than just point-to-point communication. We use it a lot for authentication. We use it a lot for kind of a protection of computations and so on and so forth. And it's not entirely clear how quantum cryptography can do this job in any way that is better than the classical thing. So I think that what we will see increasingly is a fusion of classical method of communication, especially what is known as a post-quantum crypto with a quantum, where probably quantum will be just playing a role for protecting data over point-to-point communication. It's difficult for me to just provide like specific scenario because again, I may be skeptical that anything beyond point-to-point will sort of be really lend itself as a good system for quantum crypto, but I may be proven wrong. That quantum, our experimentalists are so clever that I'm surprised all the time. So yes, there are companies that are looking at both secure communication using quantum phenomena, using optical fibers, but also using satellite communication. And the set of tools is there. And in terms of things that we can do with quantum technology, this is much easier than, say, building a quantum computer. And we can think about many other interesting things when you just can distribute this entanglement. So it doesn't always have to be for data protection. I only focus on data protection, but you can also do some other tasks that would be useful if you have distributed entanglement over the network.
Okay. I have two more. Most commercial QKD systems are based on prepare and measure approaches. What do you see intangible based system to be more useful?
Well, yes, so that's mostly related to technology, but for a long period of time, I think generating high quality entanglement was not easy. But there is, of course, a major difference, and that is something that I was pointing at the end of the talk, namely this device-independent cryptography, where you can certify devices of unknown provenance, right? So someone can come to you with boxes and say, okay, you can get them, and even if you don't trust this person, you can use those devices provided they can satisfy certain statistical criteria, which essentially boil down to the violation of Bell inequalities. You cannot do it with prepare and measure. So if you want to push, and the point that I was trying to make, if you want to minimize the assumption and push in the direction of perfect security, where you don't even trust the devices that you use, the only way to go is the entanglement-based or Bell inequality-based crypto. So the prepare and measure cannot do this exactly.
Okay. One more, and I think it's going to be the last one before we go, because for you, what time it is in Singapore is like 6 or 7 hours ahead.
Well, yeah, I'm approaching 11 p.m., but
okay.
Don't worry too much.
Thank you so much for being awake for us. Okay, what is the current best approach to generate apparently random encryption keys using a computer device?
using
a computer device.
Computer to generate what?
To generate apparently random encryption keys. Sorry.
Yeah, so it's not only, so there, of course, there are pseudo-random number generators and so on that one can use, but it's not only this, because in this case, we have to guarantee that the two random numbers just appear in two different locations and they are identical. So they have to be identical, so they have to be perfectly correlated. So that adds a little bit of extra requirement, which cannot be satisfied by any if I understood the question correctly, I'm not sure I'm really answering the question, but we do not know how to use classical pseudo-random or random number generators to achieve this objective, that we can actually have those two random numbers in two different locations, identical and secure, and we can prove the security of this. So we don't know how to do it. With quantum methods, we can do that. Yes.
Okay.
But of course, one should say that there are many in this randomness expansion and amplification. That there's a wonderful progress now on the classical side, and in quantum crypto, we also use randomness extractors to our advantage in order to generate those keys. But that's somehow the story that I didn't include as just a bit technical, I would say, but it's worth, if those who are interested, they can easily find it on the internet, and it's a wonderful mathematical development in the field.
Okay. So Artur, thank you so much for joining today and for giving us this master class about cryptography, which is very, very important and very interesting, but important for the future of many business companies. And thank you all for coming to this new online event. I would like to remind you that next week we are going to have another one, but this time it's going to be about a neurologist, which is very different area. So thank you all for coming today and have a good day ahead. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Artur. Bye.